So I'm really excited to give this talk. I gave a kind of a shortened, truncated version of it to the Cambridge 18th century seminars last year. But because I have, as I was saying to Jason, a captive Blake focused audience, I thought I would allow myself to slightly extend it to cover the scope of this paper. This paper will be published later this year in the Cambridge Quarterly. So, you know, if there's anything in it that you find interesting, you will be able to sort of reference later on, hopefully. And I suppose I'll just start there. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, Anis, that would be great. Okay. Let me fix your attention on the single figures of the prophets, those organs of embodied sentiment. This quotation comes from a lecture which was given by the artist and professor Henry Fuseli, a mentor of Blake's at London's Royal Academy of the Arts in 1801. The lecture centres around the topic of invention in painting. By invention, Fuseli means how the artist reconciles the execution of their work through technique, composition, colour, and so on, with their choice of subject. His example here is of Michelangelo's Sistine chapel ceiling. In this vast composite fresco, Fuseli finds a perfect example of invention, where each element of the work, each character and panel, synecdochally reflects the theme of the wider whole. This theme, as you well know from the iconic centerpiece, the creation of Adam, is the relationship between man and God, or in more meta-artistic terms, the relation of the creator to his creation. The specific characters within Michelangelo's ceiling, which are the topic of this paper, are the prophets, Sibyls, and ancestors of Christ. These figures make up the outer edges of the ceiling and the spandrels of the walls. Fuseli calls them organs of embodied sentiment. He finds them, because of their varied poses and gestures, to be archetypal embodiments of human emotive states. Isaiah is inspiration, Daniel is diligence, Zechariah is consideration, and so on. The Delphic, Cumaean, and other Sibyls are personifications of vigilance, meditation, instruction, divination, and so on. Fuseli's reading of Michelangelo's prophets as emotive archetypes is indicative of a wider trend in painting in Blake's period, which proliferated in and around the Royal Academy, where artists were increasingly looking to the Sistine Chapel as a source of visual language. In part because of Michelangelo's pioneering approach to painting and sculpture, and in part because of his canonization in Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, Michelangelo's work had always been greatly revered. That much is certain. However, his distinctive style had fallen somewhat out of favour in the 17th and early 18th centuries, owing to the creation of the French Academy and the change in aesthetic preferences which it incurred. At this time, the more balanced, harmonious neoclassical compositions of the Venetian and French painters were the more in vogue. Michelangelo's style, on the other hand, was characteristically monumental, muscular, dynamic, and emotionally confronting. And because of this, when visual culture moved towards Romanticism, with its focus on affect, power, drama, and the sublime at the turn of the 19th century, the Michelangelesque would again become popular in the fine arts, and especially in historical painting. New slide, please, Anis. William Blake, however, had been well ahead of this curve. From boyhood, he had frequented London's auction houses, gravitating towards the old master prints after Michelangelo, Raphael, and Dürer, which were then unfashionable, but with which he felt an obvious affinity. Across Blake's poetry and prose, the name Michelangelo is repeated more than 120 times. Blake's first print, Joseph of Arimathea, made under the supervision of James Bazire in the 1770s, was a copy of an engraving from Michelangelo's Crucifixion of St. Peter. There are several works by Blake and many elements of his visual style which bear the influence of Michelangelo prints which he collected, and this is the subject of my PhD thesis. This paper focuses on this group of drawings by Blake from around the 1770s, after Michelangelo's prophets, Sibyls, and patriarchs. I have termed this group of drawings his Sistine studies. There has not been a dedicated critical study on these drawings since the late 70s, and a new one is long overdue. In no small part because considerable progress has been made since then in terms of how we now understand Blake as an artist and literary figure. Contemporary Blake criticism, rather than further perpetuating the narrative of Blake as a lone artist operating on the margins of society, has increasingly sought to contextualise him within the social and intellectual web of late 18th century London. This is why I have chosen to reframe Blake's Sistine studies alongside Fuseli's lecture. Because firstly, I'm interested in drawing links between Blake's interest in Michelangelo and the wider Michelangelo zeitgeist in painting, which was spreading amongst his contemporaries, like Fuseli, Barry, Flaxman, and so on. And secondly, because I wish to suggest how and why these studies of Michelangelo's Sistine figures may have been an especially useful and productive exercise for Blake as an artist. We know that Blake repurposed several of these early Michelangelesque figures in his later visual works. We also know that Blake developed his own Michelangelesque figures, which repeat constantly throughout his illuminated books and paintings. My argument here is that Blake's Sistine studies and echoes of these drawings in his later works indicate his engagement with a dynamic and emergent visual culture which, at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, employed figures from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel as a source of archetypal visual language. And first, I'd like to cover the technical features of Blake's studies here, which you can see on this slide. So they are a series of 9 drawings after reproductive prints after Michelangelo's Sistine figures by the Italian engraver Adamo Scultori. Blake's studies here were likely completed relatively early on in his career, either in the 1770s when he was an apprentice engraver, or in the mid-1780s when he was working commercially. The single coloured drawing may have been completed as late as 1795. These studies are mostly done in graphite and grey ink, and they are all about the size of an A5 piece of paper. A number of them are completed on the recto verso of a single sheet of paper, so on both sides, confirming that these drawings were not intended as finished pieces, but rather as references or as drawing exercises. 7 of the drawings are now in the British Museum. They were acquired there in 1867 from the collection of Frederick Tatham, one of Blake's disciples, who had likely purchased the drawings from Blake's wife Catherine in the 1820s. 2 of the drawings, Cumea and a sketch of an ignudo, resurfaced in the art market in the early 2000s. The discovery of these lost pieces suggests, to me at least, that there are probably more studies extant. And just on the Cumea and the ignudo, the authenticity of these works has been a source of debate. The general consensus is that the Cumea, owing to the style of the hands and the handwriting at the base of the image, is likely by Blake. However, because of its colouring, critics have thought that it dates from slightly later, during the period when Blake was experimenting with darker, water-based pigments in the 1790s. The ignudo on its verso is more problematic because it does not bear much stylistic relation to the other Sistine studies. Not only is it more linear in style and in an earlier state of finish, but it does not seem to derive from the same print collection as the other drawings. It doesn't look like the same ignudo in the Adamo Scultori collection, where the other ones derive from. So my feeling is that it may have been drawn by someone else, maybe someone working alongside Blake in a workshop, though there is no way to confirm this. Next slide, please, Anise. Okay. So Blake studies are sourced from this particular group of 16th century prints. These prints were initially done in the 16th century by Adamo Scultori, but they were republished in a small folio in the 1770s by the Italian printer Carlo Lozzi, and they were extremely popular among artists in Blake's period in London, among his contemporaries. If you look on the right side of the slide, you can see that I've found some similar sketches after Scultori's engravings by Blake's direct contemporaries, John Linnell and James Barry. Both of them were known to Blake. Moreover, famous painters like Sir Joshua Reynolds and Nathaniel Hone used Scultori's engravings as a source in their paintings in the 1780s and 90s. So suffice to say, Scultori's were by far the most popular of the reproductive engravings after the Prophets and Sibyls, which was circulating in 18th century London. The reason why Blake composed these studies from reproductions and not from the Sistine Chapel directly was because he never saw Michelangelo's works in person. In fact, he never left the shores of the UK in his lifetime. His only claim to intimate knowledge of Michelangelo's work was a metaphysical one. Blake apparently once told Thomas Phillips that he never saw any of the paintings of Michelangelo, but that he knew on good authority from his friend, the angel Gabriel, that Michelangelo could paint an angel better than Raphael. Because of this, Blake's Sistine studies raise a number of questions about the nature of mediated images. For example, how might Blake, who only saw Michelangelo's works via tiny printed fragments, have interpreted the visual language of Michelangelo's monumental, imposing Prophets and Sibyls differently than someone like Fuseli, who had seen them in situ? As you can see, Scultori's reproductions remove the architectural context of the Sistine Chapel and focus purely on isolated figures. These individual characters would have been easier to print, and each of these plates could operate as motifs distributed across a public 16th century audience as souvenirs from the Vatican Chapel, which they might never get to see. There are more than 70 figures within Scultori's whole collection of prints. We can only speculate as to why Blake may have selected these particular 9 and why these 9 would have been especially attractive to him. In my view, I think it is likely that Blake would have gravitated towards figure types which related to his own creative interests. For example, familial groups. At this time, he was drafting Songs of Innocence and Experience, or figures with props and motifs, or figures in specifically evocative poses. New slide, please, Anise. So here on the left, you can see Blake's Daniel and Cumea, which are the only examples of a prophet and a Sibyl from among his Michelangelo drawings. The prophets and the Sibyls represent the largest of all the figures in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. Because of the schematic dominance of these figures, and perhaps also owing to their mythological significance, the prophets and Sibyls seem to be the most frequently studied and written about of the figure groups in Michelangelo's chapel by 18th century art critics. Sir Thomas Lawrence, third president of the RA, commissioned large-scale painted reproductions of the prophets and Sibyls for his personal study in the 1820s. Another academician, William Hilton, would visit the chapel and describe Michelangelo's prophet Jeremiah as a grand and sublime thing, which both enforces and inspires an emotional response in the onlooker. Hilton's own drawing of the Delphic Sibyl from the same year underlines this interest in Michelangelo's prophet as a source of inspiration. Another response, this time by William Young Ottley, ascribes to Michelangelo's prophet Isaiah a sublime loftiness of character and deportment. Just like Hilton, Ottley produces his own drawings after Michelangelo's chapel. These he self-publishes in a volume entitled The Italian School of Design, which is a kind of dedication to his grand tour of the 1790s, and in which Michelangelo plays a significant role. Next slide, please. One of my answers to the question of how Michelangelo's figures from the Sistine Chapel might embody themselves in Blake's works is in the recurrence of this prophet with book motif across his visual oeuvre. We see this most frequently in Blake's illuminations, probably with the intention of drawing the reader's attention to the work as a readable and writable object. See, for instance, a figure who looks very like the prophet Daniel in the background of plate 10 of Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell. This link is persuasive, not only because the pose is comparable to Blake's Sistine drawing, but also because of the playful conceptual irony of the prophet being shown in collaboration with a devil, which would be a thematically appropriate motif for Blake's anarchic marriage. Another example comes in the frontispiece of Songs. Here, in the mother figure, there is something of the Michelangelesque Sibyl. More than a direct allusion to Michelangelo's Cumea, however, I instead read this as an example of Blake using the Sibylline figure as a kind of archetype. Here, the statuesque group of mother and child becomes a universal emblem of mothers and children. The book-wielding, monumental, Michelangelesque prophet figure appears in Blake in other places too. For example, in the frontispieces of Urizen and All Religions Are One. In both of these illuminated books, Blake draws upon the visual tradition established by Michelangelo's prophets and uses it to elevate his characters to the status of monumental spiritual figures. In these instances, and this is typical for Blake, he does so with subversive intentions. Next slide, please. Another example comes in Blake's illustrations to Edward Young's Night Thoughts. Here, Michelangelo's prophetic and Sibylline figures, seated, dressed in archaic garb, hunched over books and scrolls, reading, writing, or simply contemplating, serve as constant meta-literary devices which mirror either the reader or the poet. Through slight changes in pose and expression, Blake plays with the emotive language of their attitudes. Some are static, others are uncertain, others are studious, pedagogical, and so on. And these figures guide us through the poem, gesturing towards the text or urging us to turn the page. Next slide. Having briefly contextualized and tracked how the prophets and Sibyls were read and echoed in Blake's work, I wish to turn now to a couple of the patriarchs, Abia and Aminadab, and explain how these figures relate to Blake's interest in the symbolic power of the human body. Not just Abia and Aminadab. I realize I've actually expanded this talk from the last time I gave it. Abia, Aminadab, and the other figures too. So this is Abia, the most well-known of Blake's Sistine studies. And he is one of the more minor patriarch figures from within Michelangelo's schema. And Abbia, the drawing, is generally believed to be the source or one of the sources for Blake's Newton, one of the large colour prints of 1795. Critics have argued that Blake intentionally selected Michelangelo's Abbia figure as the source for Newton because of its link to the Hebrew patriarch Avia, second king of Judah, who can be seen to represent absolute submission to divine authority. I find this reading unconvincing, as the prints which Blake was using were unlabeled, so there is no indication that Blake would have known that this figure represented Avia, and anyway, even if he did, Renaissance art historians know that Michelangelo's patriarchs don't correspond to their biblical names, but instead are sourced from figures and scenes of daily life which he would have seen in Renaissance Rome. Rather, if we think about how Blake was first taught to read prints at a traditional drawing school and then as an apprentice engraver, I think it is much more likely that he probably read Scultori's Sistine figures in a technical way. The Abbia figure, with its prostrate, introspective, pendulous pose, would not have been attractive to Blake simply because it was a biblical figure, but rather because of the fact that it was by Michelangelo and because of its expressive power. While the Abbia pose is powerfully echoed in the composition of Blake's Newton, he does make some alterations, such as revealing the face and redirecting the gaze towards the pair of compasses with which he draws his infernal diagrams. These subtle changes have the effect of lifting the figure from a pose of submission to one of authority. However, the irony here lies in how this authority is directed downwards towards the empirical world as opposed to upwards towards the heavenly poetic one. Next slide, please. It has long been established in Blake criticism that Blake was highly interested in the linguistic potential of the human body. The landmark study in this was Janet Warner's Blake and the Language of Art in 1984. A visualization of how bodily language operates in Blake comes in a two-sided drawing from his notebook known as Various Personifications. This is now held in the Harvard libraries. This diagram offers a visual key of how recurrent figures in Blake's prints and paintings correspond to sentiments such as pity, misery, weariness, and so on. Several of these figures evoke the forms and poses of Blake's earlier Sistine studies. In particular, the pity figure shares the downward-facing, outstretched arms of Blake's Abbia. Their emblematic and archetypal forms evoke the dramatic pathos formulae of Renaissance painting. These sketches indicate that Blake's early copying exercises certainly informed how he would later conceptualize the human figure in his visual work. Like Michelangelo, perhaps even more so, Blake used the human body as a cipher. If the Sistine prophets are organs of embodied sentiment, so too are Blake's figures, leaping, crouching, and praying all across the margins of his illuminated books. Next slide, please. So far, I have covered the Daniel, Cumea, and Abbia. So where and how then does Blake use his other Sistine studies? Well, the Cumea, Matan, and Abbia drawings are all examples of maternal filial groups. As I have mentioned, Blake's songs, though officially published in 1789, was drafted in 1783 to 84, concurrent with the proposed dates of these Sistine drawings. Because of this, it is possible that at this time, Blake may have been searching for pastoral or familial imagery from his personal collection of old master prints and happened upon these. The Matan, for example, may have been useful to Blake as an emblem of the nuclear familial group with mother, father, and child. The Abbia, though also familial, has a very different emotional timbre to that of the Matan and seems to suggest an emblem of motherly love or protection. Both the Matan and the Abbia figure groups were also drafted by Blake's contemporaries in the 1790s. Ottley, for example, included a version of the Matan lunette in his aforementioned print collection, The Italian School. Similarly, the Abbia group appears in Conrad Metz's Imitations. Where Metz has interpreted the mother's expression as a benignly positive one, Blake's instead gives an overall atmosphere of fear. The comparison starkly highlights the ways in which copying itself is a kind of invention, especially when the copy has passed through multiple hands. Blake's Matan study has been linked to a number of his later illustrations, including several figures in Songs, Night Thoughts, and Marriage, as well as the frontispiece to Benjamin Heath Malkin's A Father's Memories of His Child. None of these links are certain. They'll all capture the general attitude of a mother figure reaching out towards a child as an expression of maternal love. One heretofore unidentified instance of a visual echo of the Matan figure comes on plate 30 of Jerusalem. This page illustrates Blake's loss, gesturing towards two child figures, which represent the two diverging components of his soul, an Atharman and Athona. In attitude, this group echoes that of the filial Matan, for although loss is ostensibly masculine, in this illustration, Blake has converted him into a maternal feminine allegory. In terms of the Abiad group, Jenna Joy LaBelle and Michael J. Tolley have related that the wailing mother on the frontispiece of America, A Prophecy, is very like a Michelangelesque Abdiel, Abdias, or a Sibyl. New slide, please. Turning to the last two studies in Blake's Sistine series, we come to the single figures of Solomon and Manasses. With regard to Solomon, in my view, Blake may have been interested in the symbolic resonances of the archaic spinning loom. Comparable drawings of lunette figures from the Sistine Chapel by Fuseli, for example, his sketch of the writing figure from the Josaphat lunette, indicate that Michelangelo's characters were in certain instances of interest because of their props, books, canes, looms, and so on. We know that Blake, who routinely harnessed the symbolism of objects such as the anvil and the pair of compasses in the illuminated books, was highly attuned to the metaphorical power of object motifs. The loom in particular comes up in his Night Thoughts illustrations and in Jerusalem, where it is always operated either by a single figure or by a group of three. In Jerusalem, the loom takes on creative and destructive capabilities. It is fiery, shining, whirling, and terrible. The emblem of the wheel-like loom ties into the wider subversion of the allegory of Ezekiel's wheels, which underlies Blake's Jerusalem. Moreover, the loom motif might even be read as a symbolic representation of the narrative structure of the poem as a whole, fundamentally cyclical in its scope, imbued with the terrible labor of the artist, beginning with an ending and vice versa. Next slide, please. Blake's interest in the Manasses figure is likely related to the visual connotations of the figure's thoughtful, Rodin-like pose. The most striking link between the Manasses sketch and Blake's latter work comes again in Jerusalem, this time, plate 78, in an illustration of a naked, bird-headed man shown seated on a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea, with a sunset in the background. The pose of the birdman echoes that of the Manasses drawing, though this time the figure has a different configuration of its limbs, and obviously its head. Blake's birdman has been linked to Dürer's Melancholia, as well as to the traditional symbol of St. John the Baptist. While both the origin and the symbolic significance of Blake's birdman is unclear, the pose has been identified as highly expressive of a mood of conflicting emotions. Moreover, if we track the Jerusalem bird figure onto Blake's various personifications, it closely aligns with an emblem which Blake captions listlessness, which also evokes the Manasses in shape and attitude. These links serve to highlight the significance of the figure, or types like it, as part of Blake's visual library, underlining the importance of statuesque, Michelangelesque poses as a narrative tool in his illuminated books and elsewhere. Next slide, please. Finally, I wish to draw your attention to Blake's study of Michelangelo's Aminadab, which is the only study in Blake's series to which he adds an original caption, The Reposing Traveller. What has been read as most significant about Blake's caption here is the way in which it transmutes Michelangelo's Aminadab into the context of Blake's own ideas, interpreting the figure as an avatar for his poetic creativity. Jean Hagstrom, for example, describes Blake's Aminadab as a figure by Michelangelo which has been transformed into Blake's poet, the mental traveller who strides across the landscape, sometimes as a boy, sometimes as a young man, or sits under the tree and writes in a book. This motif of the reposing traveller is certainly recurrent throughout Blake's poetry. It appears, for example, in a couplet which accompanies Blake's illustrations to Robert Gray's poems. Around the springs of grey, my wild root weaves, traveller repose and dream among my leaves. As well as in his unpublished poem, The Mental Traveller, in which Blake uses the image of the traveller as an allegory for the plight of man who wanders through the ambiguous landscape of life. It is indeed Blake's reposing traveller and not Michelangelo's patriarch Aminadab who emerges in this drawing, because Blake, with his caption, has metamorphosed the biblical patriarch into the traveller poet. I realize that I haven't actually explained what the Night Thoughts image is here, but this comes in the section of Night Thoughts about man and his discontents, and this figure likely is sourced from the Aminadab, and he represents a king sort of lording over his tiny city made of straws, which is what the figure is pointing to. So that's just another case of Blake sourcing these earlier studies into later drawings in his illustrations. Next slide, please. While my referring to Blake's studies as a series throughout this chapter may have projected a sense of their being kept together, I believe that the reality is much more fragmented. For example, I would like to suggest a possible instance of Blake using an entirely new character from Scultori's set, although no direct study by Blake after this figure has yet been discovered. This figure comes in Blake's Night Thoughts illustrations. It is more than likely that, as with the other drawings in his Sistine series, Blake's interest in this character has much to do with the dramatic and emotive effect of its pose, slumped, contorted, and expressing a sense of confinement and despair. This is precisely how Blake uses the figure in his illustration, as an emblem of imprisonment and existential dread. While Blake's version of the figure is horizontally inverted, the visual link remains evident, for the leaning angle of the body is the same, and so is the height and shape of the plinth upon which the figure is lying. Blake's alterations only emphasize the theatrical attitude of the original, which indicates a specific interest in the drama of its gesture. Assuming with good reason that this Night Thoughts figure derives from the Scultori collection, we can take two useful points from this example. Firstly, that Blake may have drawn upon Michelangelo's Sistine figures as a visual source, even in cases where he may not have made an intermediary sketch. And secondly, that he may have been doing well so into the 1790s, much later than the proposed date of the other Sistine studies between 1770 and 1785. Next slide, please. David Byman argues that the Sistine studies are generally of little interest because of their status as mundane copies. However, I do not necessarily agree with this. Instead, I think that their status as copies is precisely what makes them interesting, because in these drawings, we can see Blake's early and obvious interest in the emblematic power of the human figure. Through these drawings, it is clear that Blake, as a young artist, used reproductions of Michelangelo's works as part of his own artistic development. And crucially, he did not do this independently from others around him, but rather was one of a number of artists who were each studying Michelangelo's works and looking to harness, in Fuseli's words, his sublime, epic, allegoric, lyric substance for their very own.